Good evening, everyone. It's good to be here with you. Let me get set up here. Well, we better get started because I only have 10 minutes, I guess. Yeah, but let me preface this by saying I'm not a perfect man, the way that James is going to put it there. Let's just start off by reading that passage, James chapter 3. And I want to read verses 1 through 12, just so we have these words in our head. James starts off by saying, "Not many of you should become teachers, my brothers. For you know that we who teach will be judged with greater strictness. For we all stumble in many ways, and does not stumble in what he says he is a perfect man, able also to bridle his whole body. If we put bits into the mouths of horses so that they obey us, we guide their whole bodies as well. Look at the ships also. Though they are so large and are driven by strong winds, they are guided by a very small rudder, wherever the will of the pilot directs. So also the tongue is a small member, yet it boasts of great things. How great a forest is set ablaze by such a small fire. The tongue is a fire, a world of unrighteousness. The tongue is set among our members, containing the whole body, setting on the tongue in the likeness of salt water. Can a fig tree, my brothers, bear olives, or a grapevine produce figs? Neither can a salt pond yield fresh water." We think about the nursery rhyme that we've all heard, "Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me." And isn't it interesting, as much as we want to believe that words mean nothing, that they have no weight at all, we know that deep down inside, words are actually quite powerful, aren't they? But you know what? It seems that often the right words being said don't carry nearly as much of an impact as the wrong words a lot of times. For instance, if you think about it, you can say the right words, but if you don't, their actions do not match their words. But on the flip side, if we say the wrong thing, even if we don't mean to, or we don't mean it, it doesn't matter if we don't act on that thing we said. The words can still leave a lasting effect on someone, can't they? And as I'm looking at this, James is talking about how we all can stumble in what we say, and he talks about taming the tongue, but these days, you don't need your tongue to stumble in what you say, do you? All you need are your fingers. Facebook, Twitter, social media. And it used to be that when I was growing up, they would tell you, be careful what you put online. Be careful what you text, what you post, because once it's out there forever. But I would submit to you that that's always been the case, in a sense. That when you say something, that something that you thought was nothing can stick in somebody's mind for longer than what you'll ever be aware of. And so a father can tell his daughter that she's beautiful 1,000 times, but if at some point he even jokes about her being ugly, it could affect her for the rest of her life. Make no mistake, words are powerful. We'll see that James, he compares words to a lot of things. He says our tongue, it's like a beast that can't be tamed. It's like a rudder that guides this huge ship. It's like a fire that destroys everything in its path. And so he issues this warning. He says, "Not many of you should become teachers, my brothers, for you know that we who teach will be judged with greater strictness." And that really shouldn't be shocking to us. Don't get me wrong, we should take that very seriously and let that sink in. But it shouldn't be shocking. This is a logical conclusion. Because it's one thing if I'm immature in my own mind, and I have some conclusions that are false according to the Bible, but what about when those ideas are now being spoken of in front of an audience? Those words have the potential to lead people astray. And so again, James, he compares our words, our tongue, to a fire, to a beast that can't be tamed, but think about words for a moment. I think it could also be compared to a really sharp knife. My wife and I, we just got some new knives after we got married, and they're factory sharpened. They are so sharp. And I have to be honest, we're kind of afraid of them a little bit because it would take nothing to mortally wound yourself with it. They just cut through everything like butter. But with a knife, we can do a lot of things with a knife. You can prepare a meal for your family. You can cut prisoners loose. You can even impress your friends, right? Look how sharp this knife is, right? Dave was showing off his knife to me not too long ago. But with a knife, we can also injure ourselves, can't we? We can pierce our foe. We can even murder in cold blood. With a knife, we may injure ourselves, but we might injure somebody else either due to negligence or because we purposefully meant to do it with the intent of hurting that person. Words are a lot like that, aren't they? That we can hurt people out of negligence, but we can also hurt people because that's what we wanted to do. So it's no wonder that James starts off with a warning. Because the first thing that we know about knives is that you're not going to just give them to anyone, are you? You take a sharp knife and you're not going to hand it to your child and say, okay, have at it, have fun. That would be a big mistake. No, you know that somebody needs to be mature if they're going to handle something that has so much potential to hurt. Likewise, we don't just hand the pulpit over to anyone, do we? James says not everyone should be teachers. Because with our words, we can do so much good, but with our words, we can also do a lot of damage, can't we? Because words, as we're going to see, are so powerful. And so you keep reading, and what James starts off by really sharing with us is that a controlled tongue, somebody who doesn't stumble in what they say, a controlled tongue belongs to a perfect man. James says in verse 2, for we all stumble in many ways. That's true, isn't it? We all make mistakes. We have various struggles. But he says if anyone doesn't stumble in what he says, he's a perfect man, able also to bridle his whole body. If we put bits into the mouths of horses so that they obey us, we guide their whole bodies as well. And we look at James and what he says, and that's really a profound statement. He's a perfect man, and we like to take that word perfect and say, well, perfect, it means mature, doesn't it? And I believe, yeah, that's in a sense what the word means. But isn't it funny that when we change that word from perfect to mature, we go, okay, I'm good. I can stumble in what I say every now and again. What James is saying here is meant to be lofty. It's meant to be hard to obtain. That's really what James is saying. He's saying controlling your tongue is one of the hardest things to do. Notice again what he says in verse 7 and 8. He says, every kind of beast and bird, of reptile and sea creature can be tamed and has been tamed by mankind. But no human tongue is so hard to control. And I believe one of the reasons why it's so hard to control is because there are so many ways in which we can stumble in what we say. There are different struggles that we each have associated with the tongue. And so I have a list of things here. Maybe somebody struggles with cussing. They use profane words. But somebody, they might never cuss, but they do struggle with gossip, don't they? They get together with a group and all they do is talk about other people. Or slander. Or maybe somebody struggles with none of those things, but when they teach God's word, they misuse it. And they teach in error. They stumble in what they say. How about just bold-faced lying to somebody? Insulting our brother. But you look at all these things and they have to do with what we say, but it doesn't end there. Because it's not just about what you say. Sometimes it's about how you say it. That we can say the right thing with the wrong tone, and we can discourage somebody or hurt somebody, can't we? And so here's what we have to realize as we look at this series of passages here in James. The fact is that we likely mess up in what we say far more often than what we even realize. I mean, how many times have you said something to somebody, not thinking about it, and they come to you 2 weeks later and say, you know what you said a couple weeks ago really hurt me? How often do we say things that hurt God without even realizing it? Or that cause God just to cringe? And so none of us this evening can look at this series of passages and think, you know what, I don't really struggle with that. What James is saying is this is something that applies to all of us, unless you're perfect. Is anybody perfect? No. a man with perfect control of his tongue is really a sign of a man who has impressive self-control all the way around. It's really a sign of self-control. You know, what James is saying here reminds me of one of my friends that I had. He went to West Point, and he went to the basic training there through West Point. It was really intense. But he's telling a story about how they all gathered in a circle, the men in boot camp did, and they took turns going in hand-to-hand combat with each other, one-on-one. He said when it was his turn, he decided to pick the biggest, meanest, scariest person that he could. And you know what? He beat him. But when he did that, that sent a message to everyone that was standing around in that circle. They said, if he can beat that guy, he can beat anyone, including myself. You know, controlling the tongue, I think is kind of like that. If we can beat this evil, we'll be able to beat anything, potentially, through God, of course. But that's also partially because it's really hard to not stumble in what we say if we have any sin in our lives whatsoever. And that's because sin leads us to stumble in what we say. For instance, when I commit a sin, that leads to lies and deception, doesn't it? Think about King David. But if you don't have any sin against God or your neighbor, then you'll find very little reason to deceive or lie. Or if I struggle with arrogance, that could affect my speech as well, couldn't it? It's so hard to control because anything we do could potentially lead to a temptation in what we say. And then you know what? My words can continue to protect and nurture the sin in my life. And so it becomes quite clear and obvious that we need to control what we say because James says it impacts everything else. He says an uncontrolled tongue will cause great damage. That's what it will do. Notice what he says in verses 5 and 6. He says, how great a forest is set ablaze by such a small fire. And the tongue is a fire, a world of unrighteousness. It's just full of potential evil, isn't it? The tongue is set among our members, staining the whole body, setting on fire the entire course of life, and set on fire by hell. You see, the tongue, for starters, has the potential to damage myself. Again, he talks about how if you put a bit in a horse's mouth, you can control his whole body. To some extent, James is saying what we say has to do with what we do. And so again, I think about David. Can you imagine after David committed adultery with Bathsheba, what if he had just come clean after that? What if he just stopped there and said, you know what, I messed up? Would that have impacted what he had done next? It would have stopped everything in its tracks. But that's not what he did. He covered it up, conspired to murder somebody that was a servant of his. And that sin, it compacted and got bigger and bigger and more out of control. And so this introduces kind of this idea that I believe that we see in our lives, but it's something that maybe we'll call tonight a sin snowball. It's this idea that what I do impacts what I say. And what I say, in turn, impacts what I do. In this snowball, it starts with me either saying something wrong or doing something wrong. And so, for instance, if I were to commit adultery, then I wouldn't want anybody to find out, and so I'll begin to tell lies as to my whereabouts and what I'm doing, and then that allows me to also keep on sinning, doesn't it? What I do affects what I say, and what I say affects what I do. And I'm out of control. But not only that, we know that it also has the potential to affect other people. That snowball will roll over the people we love. Because we know what we say not only has the potential to damage myself, but also others. Now, I wonder if this is what James loosely alludes to when he talks about in verse 4. He says, look at the ships. Look at the ships also. Though they are so large and are driven by strong winds, they are guided by a very small rudder, wherever the will of the pilot directs. Again, we know that whatever I say will damage me, but what I say has the potential of damaging others. And so you go along and you look at the example we just talked about, somebody who commits adultery, lies about it. That lie affects them, but then it affects their spouse. It can affect their children. It can affect their friends. And there's just this ripple effect. But what about a different scenario? What about when I misspeak concerning the word of God? Kind of like what James was talking about in verse 1. What about when I talk about God's word in such a way that it actually leads somebody astray because I'm speaking about it falsely? You know, there are boatloads, pun intended, there are boatloads of people out there that have committed their lives to false doctrine, isn't there? You want to know why that is a lot of times? A lot of times it's because these boatloads of people, they're guided by one small rudder. One preacher. One tongue. And so I look at what James is saying here, in particularly in verse 4, and it has two potential applications. Perhaps I'm the boat, and what I say will affect what I do, but also the boat could be a body of people, and the rudder could be our tongue, and the pilot could be ourselves. Because some people, they have the ability to direct others where they want them to go, don't they? We call that, at worst, manipulation. At best, influence. You know, there's a reason why Jesus refers to himself as the Good Shepherd, and he's referred to that, throughout. And elders are also called shepherds. But that's because us people, we're sheep, aren't we? I mean, we're just looking for that next patch of grass to graze from. And there's a lot of bad people out there that want to control others with what they say. They want to tell us and promise us greener pastures and lead us astray. And we've seen it in history, haven't we? You think about somebody as wicked as Adolf Hitler. And here's a guy that led a whole nation into atrocities, into wickedness. But it's no secret that people also say of him that he's one of the best public speakers that ever existed. Not the content of what he said, but the way he was able to manipulate, control people with his words. Words are powerful. And so, if you find yourself responsible for others, be responsible with what you say. Speak responsibly, if you would. And understand, and I understand, that none of us are in a position where we're going to lead a whole nation astray, are we? None of us really have that power, that potential. But we're all certainly capable of leading one or two or three people astray, aren't we? Maybe those people are our spouses or our children or our younger siblings. No wonder James says, the tongue is a small member, yet it boasts of great things in James 3 and verse 5. Because as I lead people astray, it doesn't stop there, does it? Because what I say has the potential of being repeated, doesn't it? And so as I lead others astray, they have the potential to lead others astray as well. And so we look at this, what we say has the potential to damage ourselves, damage others. Really, it just has the potential to damage anything that gets in our way. Again, he says, it sets on fire the entire course of life. And it's set on fire by hell. The tongue, when it's uncontrolled or used abusively, James says it's like this small fire, just a small flame, and it sets this forest ablaze. One of the biggest fires in California state history was called the Ranch Fire, but It burned 410,000 acres, and it destroyed 280 structures. It led to one firefighter dying, and 3 firefighters were injured. But you want to know what they found as they investigated what caused the fire? All it was one man who was hammering a spike into the ground. And as he was hammering that metal spike, a chunk of hot metal came off of his hammer and landed into a brush. And it started one of the biggest fires in history. James refers to our words like sometimes being full of deadly poison. But sometimes when we speak, we're just spewing sparks, aren't we? The point I'm trying to make here is that fire, it got out of control, it spread fast, but what we say spreads fast as well, doesn't it? And so what are we spreading with our tongue? What are we spreading with what we say? Are we spreading fires with comebacks and insults and derisive speech? I used to call them wood words when I was growing up because sometimes we say things and they're wood words. It's just wood that we're adding to somebody else's fire and causing their flame to burn hotter and higher. Are we spreading fires or are we putting fires out? Putting fires out with our speech and spreading the love of Christ, or are we spreading hatred and contempt? Because as you think about it, fire in and of itself isn't such a bad thing, is it? You know, fire, it keeps us warm. People back then, they cooked over a flame. For them, in James's day, fire was one of the only light sources that you had. We can do a lot of good with our words. But sometimes that flame grows out of control and it begins to destroy. It can cause great damage. And so it becomes, again, abundantly clear that we must tame the tongue. We must control and be careful with what we say rather than being careless. And the simple reason for that is this: it's because it's what Christians do. Notice what he goes on to say in verse 9. He says of the tongue, with it we bless our Lord and Father, and with it we curse people who are made in the likeness of God. Right? We go to worship, we sing praises, we go home, we talk behind everybody's back. From the same mouth come blessing and cursing. My brothers, these things ought not to be so. Will you be more straightforward than that? Does a spring pour forth from the same opening both fresh and salt water? And he continues with that. You can't have a grapevine produce figs, or a fig tree produce olives. A salt pond can't produce fresh water. Ask Clinton, he'll tell you how hard it is to separate salt from water. He's working on that right now. You can't, it's hard to do. I hope he can do it. You know, it's clear what James is saying here. That type of behavior, that person can't call himself a Christian. And you know, Jesus once said to the Pharisees, he said, I tell you, in Matthew 12 and verse 36, I tell you on the day of judgment, people will give account for every careless word they speak. We speak a lot of careless words, don't we? It takes nothing just to put something out there on the internet. But there it is. Don't even have to think about it. Jesus says we'll be judged for every careless word. Don't be careless with what you say. Be careful. And so we look at this and we say, well, what can we do? And I believe the answer is really found in the following verses. We can't avoid stumbling in our speech unless we become wise and get wisdom from above. But that's going to be our lesson next week. That's what it takes. It takes wisdom. But being practical in this moment, what can we do to avoid stumbling in what we say? Maybe sometimes we need to avoid gossips. That group of people I get together and all we do is talk about everybody else. I need to avoid that. You know, there's a study that was recently done, and it talked about how they proved scientifically that people feel at times a stronger bond when they are talking with somebody else about someone they both dislike. That's a temptation, isn't it? But we can't do that. Because that's not a relationship that's built in the love of the Spirit, is it? And you better believe that when we have those types of relationships, those people we call friends are going and doing the same thing to us behind our backs. We could say this about a lot of different things. Cussing. Sometimes we're in certain scenarios, certain groups that encourage us to speak with foul language. Sometimes we just need to remove ourselves from those situations, don't we? Think about what you say. That's a novel idea, isn't it? We've heard that. Think before you speak. But it's not just thinking about what we say, but again, how we say it. Because our tone sometimes can be hugely important. For instance, if I tell Jack after a sermon, hey, Jack, nice job, that's a lot different than saying, hey, Jack, nice job, right? Again, simply how we say things have the potential of building up or tearing down. It's something we need to work on and put a concerted effort towards. And so you read these verses, 1 Peter 3:15, when he's talking about being ready to give a reason for your hope, he says, do it with gentleness and respect. Or when somebody's caught in a transgression in Galatians 6:1, and he says, those who are spiritual restore him in a spirit of gentleness. 2 Timothy 2:24, he's talking about how the man of God needs to be kind to everyone, able to teach, patiently enduring evil, but correcting his opponents with gentleness. That seems to be suggesting not just what we say, but also how we say it. Really, I guess what it comes down to is the tact that we choose to deploy. You know, sometimes we shouldn't just approach somebody and just blurt out everything that's wrong with them. You know, sometimes when you correct somebody, and when we correct somebody, we can do it just simply in the form of asking a question. Hey, have you ever thought about this? Have you ever looked at it this way? Sometimes it's just about not speaking at the height of our emotions, waiting to cool down. But understand at times rebuke is necessary. Stern, bold rebuke. But even when we do that, it has to be done in such a way that it's not, you're wrong, I'm right. Not lording it over them, but showing a concern for their faith with the goal of bringing them back into a relationship with God. Words are powerful, aren't they? They are so powerful. And I could share with you a story about people that have said words to me that I've forgiven them for but stick in my mind. But the fact is we all have those stories, don't we? Those words that people said to us that we dwell on. So just remember that words, it's like a wild beast. It's like a fire out of control at times. Sometimes our words are like a knife. With words we can pierce the heart of a man so as to lead him to pain and destruction. But it was also with words in Acts chapter 2 that Peter preached the gospel, and it pierced the hearts of men so as to lead them to the gospel, to obey the gospel of Christ. Let's be careful in what we say. If you're here this evening and you would like to devote your life to Christ by obeying the gospel, if you have any spiritual need whatsoever, please come forward as we stand and sing the song of invitation.